Well, good morning, everyone. How's the conference so far?
Good.
Good? Okay, so my name is Sahil Malik. I have a pre-conference workshop here that I conducted 2 days ago. Then I had one talk, which was like, starting SharePoint development. So I'm interested in SharePoint, but I don't know where to start. And I have 3 sessions today. This is the first one, which is about custom security trimming for search. So we've heard that SharePoint is a search engine built inside of it. I happen to think that it's actually a very good search engine. And I'm talking about 2013. So they've changed the search engine between 2010 and 2013, but I'll be referencing the differences between 2010 and 2013 as well as we go. And this particular session, I'm going to talk about custom security trimming SharePoint search. And then I have another session which talks about starting app development, which is the new thing in SharePoint 2013. And then I have another session which takes us through a brief dive into CSOM and REST, client-side object model and REST API, which are very important topics if you're going to deal with SharePoint in any way, shape, or form. And tomorrow I have a full-day workshop where I dive deep into the apps model. So let's start with this topic. A little bit about me. My name is Sahil Malik. You can find my contact information here. You'll get a copy of all of these slides. And I live in Washington, D.C. I run a small company out of Washington, D.C. And we have clients almost in every time zone around the world except Australia and Japan, except those time zones. And what is this session about? I'm going to be talking about the process of SharePoint being able to crawl data sources in your organization other than SharePoint, right? So, and I would call this almost a level 300-400 session, but you know what, once you see the concepts, it's actually pretty simple. As I said, SharePoint is a very powerful search engine. In the enterprise search engine marketplace, there used to be a few products out there. I would say little by little, they've all sort of disappeared or dissipated. Like, Autonomy was bought by HP, which, now they're suing each other, and then there's Endeca and Verity, and then there was Fast, right? And Fast search engine was pretty good to start with, but then Microsoft purchased it, and they integrated it with SharePoint in SharePoint 2010. But if you were to use Fast in SharePoint 2010, it felt a little bit like running Fast on Linux. In fact, the folder structure, was still, looked like Linux in that, even though it was running on Windows. They had their work cut out, obviously. In SharePoint 2013, what they did is that they have removed what used to be the classic SharePoint 2010 search engine, which was based on SQL Server full text indexing, which is still there in SharePoint Foundation 2010. But now if you buy SharePoint even Foundation in 2013, every SKU of SharePoint comes with Fast search engine. And what that means is that you have an enterprise class search engine built into even the free version of the product. And this product scales a lot better, right? It is a lot more flexible. And the enterprise search is a little bit different than the open internet search. So in the open internet search, Microsoft and Bing are fighting with each other, but let's be honest, Google is winning by far, right? We all use Google, a lot of us use Google. But you know what, in the enterprise space, the Google is nowhere, because the challenges in the enterprise space are very, very different. Because you have a lot of content that people almost want to control how it appears in search results, right? They want to say this must appear above others. And you know what, one of the first things, Google has an appliance which basically crawls all your network file shares and everything in your company. And you set that up, and the first thing that shows up, like some sensitive HR data because somebody put it on a network drive and it was, not protected properly, right? So my point is that in the enterprise search engine space, you need a lot of tweakability, you need a lot of customizability. For sure, one of the things that we need, which I'm going to be talking about in this session, is SharePoint has the ability to crawl backend data sources, right? We know SharePoint is not the only game in town. You may have an ERP system, for instance. You may have another document management system, and you want SharePoint to be able to crawl it. You want the power of a real search engine going against it. But what's more important is that you want that backend's security principle and security rights respected when you issue a search, right? So for instance, let's say if I have a Documentum system in the backend, and I'm using SharePoint to crawl the Documentum backend. When I issue a search, if I don't have access to something in Documentum, I don't want it to show up in the SharePoint search results either, right? It should be removed from my search results. And that is the topic that I'll be talking about in this session. So that's my company name. This is where our clients are. I've written 2 books on SharePoint 2013 and 15 books in total. These are electronic books only, so I only self-publish now. So these are like really cheap, like $1 or $2, somewhere in that range. But the cool thing is that they're available on Kindle, and if you buy it, and as I learn, I keep adding to this, and you keep getting updates for free. So that's why I've gone to a purely electronic medium. So SharePoint Search in 2013, and you can find those books on Amazon. SharePoint Search in 2013, as I said, fast search is in for all SKUs. The SQL indexing is out, which means the SQL query syntax no longer works. Out of the box experience, SharePoint has the ability to search itself. When I upload a document inside of SharePoint, it becomes searchable, right? It takes a very minor configuration to make that happen. And what you get for free over there is automatic security trimming. As in, if I don't have access to something in SharePoint, it doesn't show up in my search results, right? And the SharePoint search, the way I like to compare off is like going, scuba diving in the Mediterranean, which is, like relatively warm waters. So as long as I stay in the shallow area, it's beautiful. There's sunlight, the water is so clear, and there's beautiful fish over there. But when I dive deep, there are sharks there, and it's cold there, even over there, right? So that's the best way I can characterize SharePoint search, is that there is so much you can do without diving really deep, right? And you could dive deep, but then it gets really complicated really fast. But 80–90% of the things that we're trying to do can actually be achieved without code, right? So usually we don't have to dive very deep. Now this is an example, custom security trimming. This is an example where you do need to dive deep, but you'll see that once I actually show you the code, you'll be like, this is simple. I can easily do this. So it is extremely customizable via browser and code. I have the ability to say set up authoritative pages. There's a concept called result sources. I have the ability to query other search engines from SharePoint and bring those search results right inside of SharePoint. And all this can be done through the browser, point and click. I have the ability to customize how the search results look like. Again, very easy to do. Search comes with a REST and CSOM API. Again, very easy to consume. It's like that much JavaScript that you can write and be able to consume those results in. And the coolest thing is that SharePoint Search can also index external content. How do you query external content? The process of doing that is by using BCS. BCS stands for Business Connectivity Services. BCS has the ability to bring external data into SharePoint. So any BCS source, you can just go into central administration and through point and click configure it to be able to crawl an external source. And you can also write a custom connector, right? When you write a custom connector, that's basically saying that SharePoint out of the box can crawl these certain external sources, but that's not good enough for us. We want to be able to crawl this source that SharePoint doesn't support out of the box. So we have the ability, enough hooks to be able to write some code in .NET. And with that custom connector, we can bring in external data inside of SharePoint. Now, what's different in SharePoint 2010 and 2013 is that 2013 is claims-based only, right? Claims, right? So we're all familiar with claims-based authentication is, right? So claims-based authentication is very important. And SharePoint 2013 and all the platforms out there, the .NET 4X and all, everybody's moving towards claims. So claims is a good thing, and they've added one facility in SharePoint 2013 BCS is that when you're doing the crawl, right? When you're doing the crawl, during the crawling portion, you have the ability to read the ACLs of the backend system and embed them as claims in your index, right? This is new in 2013, and we're going to use this facility to be able to do security trimming on our search results. So the challenges, obviously, that we deal with is that security is difficult, right? Backends may have different security mechanisms. They may not even use Active Directory, right? They may have a completely different mechanism. And the search that we execute, let's say SharePoint is configured to run with Active Directory, we may need a mapping between my AD account and whatever the backend account is. Or maybe there's a one-to-many mapping, possibly. Maybe there is a concept of groups that the backend applies, right? And what happens in SharePoint groups, because SharePoint also has groups, but SharePoint generally says that if I'm a member of any of these groups that have access to a resource, then I have access. But many other systems don't, approach this in a completely opposite way. They say that you must be a member of all these groups for you to have access to something. In fact, some of these backends may have a completely different security model that we can't even think about, right? Maybe they have an access right saying that today is Thursday, so based on Thursday and the weather outside today, you may have access to a resource or not. Who knows, right? But we have to respect that different backends may have a completely different dynamic security model as well. So we need to be able to, respect that. Secondly, access rights change all the time, right? So let's say I've crawled some data and I have embedded the ACLs in my index. What if the access rights changed between the crawl and my executing a search query? Because the next crawl may be 15-20 minutes away. Is it okay to show or leak that information for another 15 minutes? Maybe, maybe not, right? Do we have some facilities that allow us to trim the results very late in the process, right? And obviously, if you trim a lot very late in the process, what does that do to performance, right? So those are things we have to consider. And again, your SharePoint identity may not be the same identity in the backend system. So security is tough, right? The risks are very high. Risks of leaking information are very, very high. The scale of the problem is also very high. Why do I say that? So I basically came up with, a very typical organization, and this is not the biggest organization you may have seen. An organization with 500,000 documents, that's not that much to ask for, really, right? An organization with 2,000 users, again, not that much to ask for, with maybe 50 security groups. This is not even a big organization, right? This is a small organization. And the possible number of combinations that you may get is that many. And as I said, this is being conservative. You add another 0 over there and it gets much, much, much bigger, right? So this is the scale of the problem we're dealing with. And then there are other issues. You have word stemming. If I search for run, it must match ran or running, right? So I cannot do just a string match, and that must work with the backend system as well. Query rules. There is a concept in SharePoint search called as query rules, which basically says the user searched for this, but we think we know better, and we're going to change this search to something else, right? And that basically we say that based on the user profile and the context, we have the ability to rewrite the query. For instance, if you search for the word deck, D-E-C-K, and if you're a marketing person, then maybe you're looking for a PowerPoint deck. But if you're a carpenter, maybe you're looking for the deck that you build behind a building, right? We have the ability to formulate your query on the fly. That's called query rules. You can do this right through the browser. But again, it needs to work with the backend as well. Information leakage, right? If I search for something, even if I'm removing documents, and it says 7 documents matched, but for the same query, you get 8 documents matched, but we see the same results, then you'll get suspicious. You'll be like, well, there must be one document here that I'm not seeing. So that's information leakage. We don't want to do that. Sorting and ranking results, right? So let's say I've got multiple backends that I'm searching for, and the user has got one simple search box, and they just issue a search, and you want all of these various sources to sort of do like a zipper merge based on their ranks. How do we decide the ranks based on content sources? That's another problem we need to solve. And more and more and more. I mean, we can have literally a 3, 4, 5 day workshop just on search. It is a pretty deep topic, right? Oh boy, right? So search is complex, but relax. There's a solution. So before we dive deep into how SharePoint search security works, let's also take a quick crash course in SharePoint security. SharePoint uses 2 kinds of authentication in 2013. I'm not talking about Classic. It can work with Classic as well, but let's ignore that, right? We never use Classic, so let's move off of that. But even if we stick with claims, there are 2 kinds of security that we need to think of. Number 1 is user security. Number 2 is apps security, right? User security is based on WS Federation. Claims-based WS Federation. And apps security is based on OAuth or something very similar to OAuth, right? They're both different from each other and we need to consider both. First, let's talk about user security. The way user security works in SharePoint is that first the user hits SharePoint with his browser and says, hey, I'd like to access this resource. And the SharePoint, and this is an anonymous request. SharePoint says, are you kidding me? You need to authenticate, right? And at that point, the user is presented with a list of choices, right? A list of choices in which the user can pick, the authentication credentials that they can provide. So user can say, look, I have a live ID, for instance, or I have, my Active Directory account, or I have something else, right? At this point, the user is redirected to an identity provider. Now, the important thing is that whichever identity provider we're talking of has been pre-trusted in SharePoint already, right? You do this using certificates and a couple of PowerShell scripts, etc. So let's say if you say, hey, we're going to trust your ADFS endpoint, the point is that it's already been trusted. That's why you've been redirected to it, or the user picked his identity provider. Over here, the user provides their credentials, right? And then the user is given claims as a SAML token. And then the user is redirected back to SharePoint, but not the SharePoint website, okay? Not the SharePoint website. There is another STS that resides inside of SharePoint, and you are redirected to that, right? And that STS has the ability to add more claims at that point, claims augmentation, right? And you have the ability to also write custom claims providers at that point to add more claims on top. Why would you want to do that? Because once you have added those claims, then you can resolve for those claims at a later date. So for instance, let's say that we have a custom need in our organization, and I'm just cooking this out of the blue, but claims-based authentication is very, very flexible. But let's say our need is that when I search for users, I am only shown users in my department, right? Can't do this out of the box. But what we could do in this scenario is that we can embed your department claim in here, okay, during sign-on, and then during name resolution, we have the ability to check your department, because you will have that claim, because you're an authenticated user, right? And we'll have the ability to check your department and then resolve only the users that are in your department, right? Now this is very simple to do now, right? You could not do this with classic Windows Auth. So you see that authentication becomes a whole lot more flexible when you go with claims-based authentication. Now let's bring this back to search. When we are crawling the backend, we are embedding ACLs in there. It would appear to me that rather than embedding ACLs in the index itself, why don't we just embed the ACLs over here, right? Why don't we embed the ACLs of the backend system as claims at that point? And the reason we don't do that is because as a best practice, you need to keep these ACLs, as less as possible. Because every element that gets rendered on the SharePoint UI, we have to, the code has to see if you have access to it. And for you to have access to it, it has to go through the collection of claims that are associated with you, right? And grant or allow you access. So if you go from 7 claims to 20 claims, that's a lot more work for SharePoint to do, right? So we want to keep your claim packet as light as possible, right? So that is why we don't like to embed ACLs in here. Not to mention the logon process becomes more complicated, because if I have to, see, the index runs offline, right? And it can run at a throttle pace, it can run slower. So we prefer to do that offline, and the data is pre-cached and cooked at that time, right? Whereas over here, you'd be doing the check on the fly to the backend system during sign on. And you know what? After you sign on, your claims don't change until you sign out and sign in again, right? At least in SharePoint, right? Now, other systems may allow claims augmentation on the fly, but you can't do that in SharePoint, right? WS Federation, you can't do that. So This is the issue. This is why we don't like to put search-related claims over here. Now let's talk a little bit about apps also. As I mentioned in my yesterday's talk in my pre-con, and I'll be talking in depth about this in the post-con, is that when you work with SharePoint and you're using an app, the app and SharePoint itself can have two completely separate security mechanisms, right? I can be authenticated to SharePoint with Active Directory credentials, and I could be authenticated to the app using forms-based identity. That's totally okay, right? And then they are also running on different URLs, right? The app and SharePoint are running on completely different URLs, and the app has been pre-trusted inside of SharePoint. And what happens in this scenario is that when I am accessing the app, and through the app I'm accessing a SharePoint resource, like search, right? So in that case, what happens is that my request is sent to SharePoint, right? And by default, both the app's identity and the user's identity is considered in performing something, right? So, and you have a choice of not using the user's identity. There's a mechanism in which you can say, I care only about the app's identity, right? So that's called the app-only principle. But the app principle and the user principle is like a user account to SharePoint, right? We don't see app principles in the people picker, but they are there in the object model, right? You'll see them in the object model. So the app identity plus the user identity, or just the app identity, is evaluated when you are querying the backend system, right? So that identity, you know, when you're issuing the search, must be considered when you're issuing SharePoint searches to the backend, right? And when you're doing a crawl, you're doing a crawl of the backend data source, and the backend data source may have an authentication mechanism that is even, you know, completely different, a completely, you know, third authentication mechanism from both SharePoint and the app. And here you have the ability to do a mapping between this backend data source's claims, right, and the user claim or the app's identity, right? This is the beauty of claims. It's very, very flexible. So there are three concepts to learn about custom security trimming as far as SharePoint goes. Number one, early binding, right? Early binding stands for removing the results, during, at query time, but before, right before you hit the index. Second is late binding, which is I've gotten my search results and I want to remove results later in the process. And the third is the process of embedding ACLs in the index during the crawl. Now, I want to start this portion with a little disclaimer that number one, we're working with SharePoint. And I like to say this, that the coolest part of our jobs is that 50% of our income is based on watching progress bars, right? Secondly, I'm showing search, and search is going to require things like full crawl. It's going to require me to index a backend data source. It's going to require me to register a bunch of things. So what I've done is that I have created 2 snapshots of my virtual machine with things, you know, already set up. So we're going to probably spend some time booting up a VM, doing a crawl and things like that, attaching to a process. So there's a little bit of, you know, wait, etc. involved. And I'm sorry, I can't make the wait any more exciting than it really is, right? So, but, you know, that's just something we have to go through. So let's talk about late binding. There are pros and cons of all of these steps. Late binding gives me the best possible results because results are removed as late as possible, right? But it requires an on-the-fly query to the backend data source. So it's not very efficient. So you saw that big number I showed you earlier. Imagine if I had to query the backend for that big number all the time. Not practical, right? So it's not efficient for large amounts of data. Early binding, on the other hand, reduces the number of results being returned by the index, right? And therefore, it removes the need for late binding to a great extent. Okay, so this is how we approach search. That our first step over here is to use early binding. And obviously, all of this is possible only if the index has the ACLs embedded inside of it. So assuming that the index has ACLs embedded inside of it, then I would do a query to the backend, and then using early binding, I would remove as many results as possible based on what the index tells me. And then I get a smaller set of results. And then I would use late binding on only that smaller set of results. Right? Now you may ask yourself, you say, well, when I did the crawl and I formed the index, I did not have access to a certain item. But between this crawl and the next crawl, I have been granted access to a certain item. But based on this architecture, this item will not appear in my search results. Okay? Yes, that's true. It will not appear in your search results. And you know what? It's okay. Because 15 minutes later, it will appear in the search results. It's a matter of 15 minutes. Or however you set up your search. I mean, you can bring it down to as low as 4 to 5 minutes. But the point is, this is the thing about search. There has to be a delay. Right? There has to be a delay. When I put something on the internet, it takes Google about 24 hours to find it. It doesn't show up instantly. And that is, a trade-off we make. But what's important here is that they have weighed the scales in favor of not leaking information to you, right? So if I was granted access, so I don't see the result for 15 minutes. But if I was removed access of a certain item after the crawl, then it is removed immediately. Of course, I have to write code for that, but they've given us the hooks to do that. Let's think of this as an example in real world. We do this in the real world all the time, like when we travel. An example of early binding, let's say if I was going to China, I would have to get a visa for China, right? So before I have even stepped on a plane, sometimes even before I've bought an air ticket, I have to go through this process of vetting, and the Chinese government basically makes sure that I'm not a terrorist or a drug dealer or whatever, and then they would grant me or deny me a visa. Now at this point, they could deny me a visa, and I don't make it to the index even, right? Or make it to the queries, not the index, but make it to the search results, right? But let's say that I have been granted a visa and now I fly over to China. Over there, I'm going to run into something like that, passport control. That's called late binding. Over there at the very end, they can still turn me back, okay? They can still turn me back. They can say, your visa is based on, fake information you provided, so we're going to send you back. It's possible, right? So that is an example of late binding. As you can see, late binding is more expensive. So we don't want to send people back from here. We want to stop them earlier in the process if possible. And that's exactly how we do it in SharePoint also. And the important part over here is the key. My claim, this is my identity, right? I am presenting this to both the embassy and to the passport control officer to prove who I am. Right? And this is the keys to unlock. Obviously, claims, I can have, many claims. This is just one claim, but you get the idea. Let's talk a little bit about the SharePoint search architecture also. This is new in 2013. Basically, the way it works is that, SharePoint search architecture, you have content in the backend that is being crawled all the time, right? And you can set up, full crawl, incremental crawl, and then 2013 introduces another layer called as continuous crawl, right? So what happens over here is that I'm continuously doing a crawl, and then I create an index out of that. And then when the user issues a search query, then the query goes against the index, and it gives me results. So potentially, I could have many content sources being crawled all the time, right? And you also see that analytics also feeds into the same information right now. So now in 2013, analytics is a lot more scalable. And if I was to click on a search result and we all happen to click on the same search result all the time, then it gets ranked higher because analytics is based on that, right? So analytics has gotten, let's say, finally usable. So basically, if we zoom into this content portion over here, the crawling portion, you have the ability of sticking in custom connectors, right? And custom connectors work in SharePoint through BCS. And SharePoint comes with some connectors, but you can write your own in .NET, right? So you can write your own connectors, and in that connector, you would have the logic of embedding claims. So let me go into my virtual machine over here, and I'll show you exactly what I've done. So I have a simple example that I'm reading over here. So basically my example is based on this product.xml. And inside of this product.xml, I have some products, as you can see, right? So I'm going to collapse these. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, let's see how many, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 products, right? And each one of these products has got a section here which tells me about security, right? So there is something called as claim ACL meta, in which I have put in various values. Now, the values I'm using here are like weird. They're like, access, deny, which are pretty easy. But then I've added a couple of custom ones also, right? Claims is very flexible. But what I'll show you later is that basically I'm reading these ACLs, and based on that, I am, removing or granting access to things, right? And I have the ability to write whatever logic I want to be able to do that. So this is my connector code, and we don't have time to walk through every bit of it, but basically there's a method in here. So basically you implement a class. This is getting called from somewhere. So inside of here, there is a method called get documents from file. And basically I am reading that products.xml, and somehow I've configured that in my connector, like when I set it up in SharePoint. I'll show that in a second. And if you go further down here, you'll see here that when I add the document to the index, I am adding the security descriptor, right? And the security descriptor calls a method called getSecurityACL. And here I'm basically going through the details of whatever claims that are embedded in there, and I'm embedding that in my index. Once I have written this connector, at the end of it, the connector is a DLL. Then I would put that DLL in the GAC, right? And once I put that in the GAC, I would install that inside of SharePoint with some PowerShell commandlets. It's a new SP Enterprise Search Crawl Custom Connector, right? And then I restart search, and then I ran another command over here to basically get the crawl properties out of the products.xml file, right? And then I would go into central administration. I go into manage service applications. Let's give it a second. And then I go into the search service application, and I would go into content sources. And I've already set this up, but what I did is that I went and created a new content source, and I would give it a name, and I basically choose custom repository, and because it's been registered, I see XML doc as a valid choice over here. So I've already set this up, so let's go back here, and I'm going to edit it so we can see how I've set it up. And basically I've set it to give it a start address in which I'm pointing it to a file that lives on my disk under C code other connector. And if I go to C code other connector, and that is the file that I'm crawling, right? So once I have done that, then I would go ahead and run a full crawl, which, as you can see, that I've already done. So it took about 3 minutes to do, so we don't have to spend 3-5 minutes looking at it over here. And then I can look at the crawl log over here, and it looks like it had 11 success hits. And if I look in here, you can see that I'm crawling these items, which are basically represent. Let's open the products.xml one more time. They represent the same objects that are embedded inside of that XML file. So I'm successfully being able to crawl, and I'm successfully being able to embed the ACLs, right? Now, let's move further. Now let's talk about this portion here. What happens when I execute a search query? What happens in this case is that you would talk to the SharePoint STS and you're authenticated at this point. So we know who is executing the search query, right? And one thing to know about SharePoint is that it's got something in it called as distributed cache. Distributed cache, as the name suggests, caches stuff for performance. SharePoint will never store anything in distributed cache as far as search goes, except anonymous queries, right? The reason they do that is because if they were to store things in cache, then they could potentially get out of date. But anonymous, it doesn't matter. So authenticated queries, they are never stored in distributed cache. So the query basically is sent over to the index, and at that point we know who you are. So we know your SharePoint identity. Okay? And based on that identity, we have the ability to query the index, and in the index we can see what ACLs are embedded inside the index, and we can match them up with your SharePoint identity, users or groups. And then we can give you access or deny, and the results that come back are trimmed. And this is the job of a pre-connector, search pre-connector. This is early binding. And then once the results have been given by the pre-connector, at that point they give us another hook in which I have the ability to possibly query the backend live and be able to trim the results out. And that's called as a post connector. Right? So first I do pre-trimming based on what was crawled, which may be out of date, and then I've gotten 10 results back, so I have a much smaller set of results to work with, and then for each one of those results I can query the backend and I can see what you have access to. And that's post connector. Now obviously, querying the backend is optional. In fact, all of this is optional. You don't have to have a post connector. So you have different choices that you may want to use. If you have like hierarchical security, maybe you want to use pre-trimming, allow deny as post-trimming. But if you have a completely dynamic set of security, maybe you need to use both. And you have to choose between one or the other. So when you say late binding, there's some pros and cons to that, as you can see. So late binding means that there's only so much data that I can query, but the results are very accurate. But in early binding, maybe I have the ability to query more data, but it could be a few minutes out of date, right? So, and also in search, you can configure and customize SharePoint search in a lot of ways, and you can scale search quite quickly as well. So it does get to somewhat complex hardware and software setup that you have to go through. You have to consider every part of the equation, but it is possible to tweak SharePoint search enough that the crawls are very, very quick. So you want to reduce the reliance on late binding and increase the reliance on early binding, right? It's possible to customize SharePoint search to be able to do that. So again, concepts to learn. I'm coming back to this slide. Early binding, which was removing results on query. Late binding, removing results after query. And the keys to unlock are embedding ACLs. And if I was to translate that into what we need to think in SharePoint terms, early binding is pre-trimmer, late binding is post-trimmer, and the keys to embed is the connector logic. And potentially you can have many post-trimmers, right? You may have multiple backends that you're querying through SharePoint, and each one of them may want their own pre-trimmer. Of course, you can have many pre-trimmers also, right? You can have many connectors also. And the way these post-trimmers work is that the order you register them in, they get called in that order. So the first one gets to remove first, and then another, but everybody gets to play with all the search results, right? So that's how it works. So the pre-trimmer design that I have, and I'm going to go through that in a second, is that the user issues a search. And in this search, I have the ability to, I have the user's identity, but I want to match that identity with the backend. So if I go to my backend, and my backend, as you can see, is pretty fancy, but if you go in here, I have a claim value called user, user2, that's the value. There are different values here, like this one is user1, this one is user2, I have user1 again, and somewhere down here I have a user3. And I want to be able to say that the person that I'm logged into SharePoint as, which is ws/administrator, ws is my domain. So ws/administrator is really user1, user2, and user3. So I have done that using a text file. If you go in here, it's called datafile.txt. And if I was to open this, you see here the ws/administrator is really 3 users. So if I issue this search, right, let's go back to the catalog and let's see, I should see the first, well, I'll see all of them now, right? But I'll see user1, I will see user2, and I'll see user1 and 3, and also 3 is further down below. So that is how, the search results will work. Now, I've also built a 30-second delay. So basically this datafile.txt, I read it once every 30 seconds. So whatever, and this is, you should do this for performance purposes. You shouldn't read it on the fly all the time. But this datafile.txt, because technically what you're doing over here is that you are reading the other, systems, groups. So you want to do this on a cache basis, or this process needs to be fast, because there's a rule built inside of SharePoint Search is that if search doesn't return results in 15 seconds, it errors out. So the query must finish within 15 seconds. The whole thing must finish within 15 seconds. So that's how I'm executing search. But you know what? There is one other thing that I need to do, which is I can't just use this search box here, because SharePoint doesn't know how to render the search results, because this is a new kind of item I have created. So it doesn't have a display template for this new kind of item. So I could write a display template, which was more work, and I had a limited amount of time this morning. So what I did is that I wrote a little web part to do the same thing. So what you can do with search is that, or SharePoint search is exposed over REST-based API. So I could simply do this. I could say HTTP SP API search query. You see that query over there? _API/search/query query text is equal to laptop. Simple REST-based query. So basically I'm searching for the word laptop. Let's give it a second. And you see the result returns me the results in XML, but this is the REST API, so I can also get the results back in JSON. So I wrote a simple web part to be able to do this. So let me just quickly open that web part. It is a sandbox solution, but you know what? I'm not using any server-side code, so it's okay. It's not deprecated. Could I have written an app? Yes, I could have written an app. But the reason I didn't write an app, again, I don't have enough memory, so I couldn't do search and app at the same time because the services would crap out. But let's go back here. And this is the kind of stuff we will deal with in SharePoint when we develop, that we have to tweak it and sort of bring it all together. But the search web part is written in pure JavaScript. It's a visual web part. I have a search query input type text box, okay, nothing special. I have a span, which when I click on it, I run a JavaScript method called issue search, which is this method up here. And in issue search, I call this URL, and I pass in the query terms that have been put in. And then I run an AJAX call, and I send this accept header application/JSON OData is equal to verbose. Okay, and then I would run Fiddler to basically see exactly what happens behind the scenes. So what you can do here is that this is not sending that that HTTP header. But what I can do at this point is I can run Fiddler, and I can trap this request as it goes back and forth, and I can embed a header myself. It's going to install a new version of Fiddler now. Just give it a second. Let me get the search query ready in the meanwhile. Notepad. Yeah, it's installing a new version of Fiddler, but that's what we have to deal with. So let's come back to the search web part. And I also need this guy here. Okay, so Telerik Fiddler starts up. Fiddler is like so awesome. So now I have the ability to execute that search query, and when I execute the search query, Fiddler will capture that result. But what I can do is I can go to this filters tab now, and I can choose to use filters, and I can say set request header, and the request header I want to set is accept to match what my query is supposed to do, and I'm going to basically pass in this value to this header over here. And with this header set, SharePoint will now return the results as JSON. So I'm going to come back to my browser, and I'm simply going to hit refresh. Obviously the browser thinks it's still XML, the browser is confused, but now I can go back into my JSON, and I can go back into Fiddler, and I can start looking at the structure of the results. So what I'm doing over here is that I see that the results come on in json.d.query. Under that there is a node called primary query result. I open that. Then there is something called as relevant results, and under that there is something called as table, under which there is something called as rows, and then results, and looks like that's where my results are. So again, it was data.d.query.primary query results.relevant results.table.rows.results. You don't have to memorize this. You can just pick it up from Fiddler. And if you go back into Visual Studio, you will see that I am doing exactly the same thing here. I'm using jQuery to go through that array. I'm doing data.d.query.primary query result.relevant results.table.rows.results. Finally there. Okay, now I get the results. It looks like I'm getting 10 results back over here, as you can see. Now what is the structure of each result? And that's got cells. So basically next thing I do is that I look at cells.results. Okay, and in here looks like I'm getting a lot of data. So I went in here and I started looking at, it gives me the rank, it gives me the doc ID, it gives me work ID, it gives me title, it gives me author, site. Looks like the title would be a good thing to show, right? So that's what I'm doing next. That basically if key is equal to title, then embed that or append that in the search results div and return false to get out of this method, okay? So that I don't keep going through the loop. If I found the thing I was looking for, there's no point going over it again. And then basically, run over the next result and so on and so forth. And the end result of that is that I'm going to close Fiddler. The end result of that is that I can come back here and I can execute a search for, say, laptop, click on search, bam, here are my search results. It was pretty easy, wasn't it? It was pretty easy. Now, okay, my search is working, but is it trimming? It's not trimming yet, because I had 10 search results, 10 total items, and I'm getting all 10. So how does the pre-trimmer work? So I'm going to come back into my pre-trimmer over here. This is my pre-trimmer, and I've hard-coded stuff in here, pardon me, but basically I'm reading this file called datafile.txt. It is at this path, C code other pre-trimmer datafile.txt. So let's go there. Datafile.txt, it's already open. And I've basically said that the logged in user, ws/administrator, is really these 3 users in the backend system. And let me go back into the pre-trimmer. I'm going to go all the way down here. And you see that I have basically said that, hey, cache this for 30 seconds. So I'm going to change that data file. Okay, I'm going to change that data file, but it'll take about 30 seconds for the results to reflect. Fingers crossed. I hope this works. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, and I built this morning, so it may or may not work. But let's come back here. I'm going to go to this, say I'm going to remove user 2. Now, if I remove user 2, who is user 2 over here? User 2 is silver laptop, right? M158 silver. So I'm going to remove user 2, save, and it may take up to 30 seconds. So let's come back here, search. You see, silver just disappeared. I got lucky. The 30 seconds happened right then, right? But if I add user2 back in there, file, save, search. Now it'll take 30 seconds. Come on, let's do it. Don't make me look like a fool. Well, in 30 seconds, trust me, it'll show up. Come on. The thing, maybe I should have put like a spinner over here. 30 seconds, huh? So let's wait till over here. 520, there you go. Looks like it works. Yay. How do I debug this, right? In order to debug this, first I didn't talk about how did I register this pre-trimmer. Like, let me talk about that first, and then we'll talk about debugging. Come back here. Registering the pre-trimmer is also a little PowerShell script I have to execute, right? And it's actually a lot simpler than you'd expect. It's basically new SP Enterprise Search Security Trimmer dash search application, pass the managed service name, give it the type name, and at the very end, ID. So it's basically one PowerShell command that allows me to register a new search security trimmer.
Do you associate the security trimmer with a single content source, or does it just then apply it to every content source?
You are registering a security trimmer for every content source.
Okay.
Yeah, so what happens is the index has all content sources in it. Now this thing gets called, and you're passed in the URL, and then you pass in the identity, and you can do the match.
Okay.
But it doesn't really care, which one is it. So performance is very, very critical here. Because I'm going to do, I can show this via debugging. So what I'm going to do is at the pre-trimmer, I'm going to hit a breakpoint here, and I'll just wait for 15 seconds. And you'll see that the search will fail because I waited for 15 seconds. So all the stuff that you're doing here needs to finish within 15 seconds, right? So you have to keep that in mind.
What I mean is how, like, let's say you were indexing documents and these products. How do you tell your pre-trimmer just to ignore the documents?
Okay. You are passed in the object in here, in the pre-trimmer, what you need to do trimming on. So you know what you're trimming on.
Cool. Okay.
So that'll solve that problem. Good question though. Okay, so I have some breakpoints set up inside of here, right? I'm going to go ahead and attach to a process. So we'll know exactly what happens during the pre-trimming process. I'm going to say debug attach to process. Again, this is how we debug SharePoint. We debug attach to process all the time. How many of us here work with SharePoint on an active basis as developers? Do you agree? We have to attach process all the time. It's a pain in the ass to do it. I'm being recorded, but it's a pain in the donkey to record to debug for SharePoint. It is what it is, but it's very powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and search on username, and I'm going to look for node runners and mssearch.exe. I'm going to attach to all of those because I don't know which node runner is responsible for this. I just attach to all of them. Now this makes me a little nervous. So the breakpoint may or may not be hit, but luckily most of us are SharePoint devs, so these are issues with SharePoint. But I'm going to come in here and I'm going to hit search. Nah, it looks like my breakpoint is not getting hit. Yeah, it's not getting, this is we run into with SharePoint all the time because the PDB is here and the DLL is in the GAC, and Visual Studio is confused between the two. So unfortunately I can't show debugging here. Maybe it'll work in the post trimmer, right? So let's leave that for over there. I mean, I could make this work. The way to make this work would be that I would redeploy the DLL, I would restart the search services, and then the breakpoint will get hit. We have limited time. You've done this many times over and over again. We'll try that in the post trimmer, right? We're going to go through the same process over there. But just trust me on this, that basically if I was to spend 15 seconds debugging, the search results will break, right? So just trust me on that. Okay, so I'm going to stop debugging here. And now, with the magic of time travel, I'm going to go into a separate snapshot that I have where I have set up the post trimmer, right? So let's go ahead and boot this other snapshot up. And this is again, why I virtualize. I would not develop for SharePoint without virtualizing. You just have to virtualize for SharePoint. All right, so let's come back to pre-trimmer. Now, all right, I don't have any slides for post trimmer, so I guess we just have to wait for this VM to come back up. So let's give it a second. Any other questions so far? Following through? Pretty clear? It's not complex, is it? Yeah, it's not complex. So it's like, but because it is code and search, people are like, oh my God, it's a level 400 session. It's actually, but if you think about it, it can get complicated because performance is very, very critical here, right? All these things are being done while the query is running. So you have to keep performance in the back of your mind, whenever you do this. So you just have to keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, please wait. All right, we'll wait. Yeah, well, can't do much about this, so. But as SharePoint devs, we're pretty used to this, right? Okay. Here we go. Right. Okay. So now I'm going to show you the post trimmer. It looks like we might actually finish before time, but that's okay. So the post trimmer is this over here. All right, let's open this. Just thinking. Okay. In the post trimmer, I am implementing an interface called iSecurityTrimmerPost. Right? And that gives me an initialize method in which I don't need to do anything, but that depends on your logic. And then I am implementing a method called checkAccess. Now what happens is that after the search has finished and the pre-trimmer has done its job, the post-trimmer kicks in at that time. Okay? So the post-trimmer is going to get a lesser number of documents. So the documents that I'll get will be in document crawl URLs. All the possible ACLs will be in document ACLs. Right? And I can get the currently logged in user as the past user identity. And then I can write my logic, right? And the return of this is bit array, right? And then I can basically write up a bit array in which I can write a true or false for each one of those documents. And if I say true, then it's not trimmed. And if I say false, then it is trimmed. That's it. The key difference over here is that I'm working on a lesser set of documents, and technically speaking, this deny thing that I've just hard-coded in here, I would have queried the backend to do this. Okay, so with that background, let's talk about how did I register this post trimmer. Yes?
I have a question about that bit array.
Mm-hmm.
How does that interact when you have multiple post trimmers involved? Does the first post trimmer run and the second one gets just the stripped out stuff?
Just the stripped out stuff.
The whole set
no, it gets just the stripped out stuff.
Cool, okay. So you don't have to worry about combining the bit arrays or anything?
No. And the post trimmers run in a certain order, and the order is in which you register them. Yep. Cool. Okay, so let's come back here. And, okay, what the hell was I saying? Yeah, how did I register this post trimmer? I put the DLL in the GAC, that's step number 1. Step number 2, again, I say new SP Enterprise Search Security Trimmer, pass in the search application, pass in the type name, and give it an ID in the end and the rule path. Okay, and this will hook in my post trimmer, and then I have to restart the services. And that'll hook in my post trimmer. Simple as that. So with this background, let's go open that products.xml one more time. And this time I'm going to open that products.xml in Visual Studio because we're going to edit it on the fly. Visual Studio, here we go. And let's see. So you see here that I've added a deny ACL over here. Right? So with this deny ACL, I should hit in code, I should come in here and it should remove one result. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire open SharePoint. Just give it a second. Waiting for SP, working on it. It's a perfect opportunity to get a drink. All right, let's see who'll finish first, me or SharePoint. I often do this. And if SharePoint wins, I just pretend that the war between machines and people has started and machines won. Okay. So I'm going to go and search for laptop. I really should put a spinner over here, but it's just demo code. So search, bingo. Okay, let me actually make it simpler. I'm going to search for this M1548. Okay, paste, search, yay, 2 results. Okay, but if you see in my index, if I search for, I got 1, 2, 3. So it is removing 1. Let's go ahead and run this in debug mode. I'm going to say debug, attach to process, and I hope breakpoints get hit. Otherwise, we have time, so we'll restart services. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So search on username, actually search on process. Let's go for node runner and select all of these. Say attach, attach, come on, attach, 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 attach. Okay. All right, breakpoints are enabled, so that's a good sign, right? So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to issue this search again. Okay. F10, F10, so it's looking at the AC. Let's see what was passed in here, okay? Document, I have 3 things passed in. I have 3 ACLs. Okay, session properties are nothing, and the passed in user identity is, WS administrator. So I can go through here and I can say F10, F10, F10. I'm just going to continue. Okay, retry should be performed. Stop debugging. I think it's just because I took too long. And you see here it gives you current operation timed out after 15 seconds. Okay, so that's what happens. But let's try again. Let's issue a search.
Is there a way of making that time out longer for the purposes of debugging?
I don't know.
Would you
I don't know.
unit test it somewhere?
I see what you're saying. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. Shoot me an email about that. I'll reply. But I don't want to give you BS info. So I don't know if there's a way to make it longer. My hunch is that there should be a way. There is. Okay. So, but I don't know how to. So if you have info, feel free to share. But my hunch is it should be possible, but that's what it is out of the box. So usually when they set these numbers, it's also for a good reason. So usually I don't like to, like the SharePoint 2010 workflows, there was a limitation which the number of concurrent workflows running per web front end was 15, right? It's a very, very low number. 15 workflows running for a whole company, come on, right? But it's the 15 for a good reason, because it bangs up your SQL server like a Japanese car on Indian roads. Right, so there's a reason they set that number at that. So anyway, I'm sure there is a way. I can email people and ask, or if you have the answer, that's great too. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and debug, attach to process. I'm going to look for node runner. Come on, LMNOPQ and node runner. Attach, and this time I'm going to debug a little faster. So basically I'll just F5, once I hit this breakpoint, I'll just hit F5 to reach here. So I'm going to hit search, and I see F5, and you see here therefore one of the documents, it is trying to remove it from the results. I'm going to F5, and you'll see that it gets hit only once, but the loop ran 3 times, and it is actually removing the document. Now I'm going to go back to my fancy backend system, and I'm going to change that deny to access, and unfortunately we have to wait for the crawl to occur now. Now, you may say, I thought this was on the fly. Why do I have to do a crawl? Right? I have to do a crawl now for that ACL to get picked up. But I thought the whole point of post trimming is that I can query on the fly. So remember that example I told you earlier where I didn't have access to something, now I've been granted access. So it's not going to show up until the crawl occurs, right? So they've taken the safe approach is what I'm saying. So I'm going to content sources and I'm going to issue a full crawl. And tell you what, we have to wait for the crawl to finish. So a few minutes. Meanwhile, yes?
You say if it is the other way around, like if the access is, if the permissions are taken off from someone, then we can write a code to just give the access straight away between the crawl and the search query.
No, so that's the thing. In SharePoint 2010 fast search engine, you had the ability to push content into the index.
Right, okay.
2013, they have removed that ability.
Okay.
So you cannot push things in on demand. You have to wait for the crawl to occur. And to compensate for that, they have introduced something called as incremental search. And with incremental search, it reduces the amount of time between, the search is not working, not finishing, whatever.
So
crawls.
on the other hand, if we take the permission off from some document, then
Mm-hmm.
we'll take the contents off the indexing.
Yes.
Okay.
So what's the question?
What I'm saying is like, if we grant the access
Yeah.
to someone during this, when the call was done and when you run the query, these 15 minutes at a time,
Mm-hmm.
you said that it doesn't push the content in, right? If you're granting the access to some
Yeah.
content, right?
So it will not show up in the search results until, yeah.
But if somebody had already had the access,
Mm-hmm.
but the access was taken off, the permissions were taken off from there.
Right.
In that case, you said we can write a code.
That's your post trimmer. That's right here. You write that code over here.
Yeah.
So that gets done on the fly.
Right.
But the kicker over here, the trick over here, is that you're working with a lot lesser number of documents.
Okay.
So, so it's okay.
So you could point that maybe at a database which had the user permissions.
Exactly.
Going to the index.
Exactly.
To deny your access.
Exactly. I wouldn't point to a web service, it's going to be too slow. Database, probably okay. So you would have to build something like that on the other side, yep. Let's see, it probably should have picked it up by now. Search. And you see that it did not hit that. And I get 3 search results, yay. Cool, so it seems to work. Not bad, huh? Not bad at all.
So the ACLs list, does that correspond to the entries in the URLs list? So if it's index number 1 in the URLs list, you can look up index number 3 or index number 1 in the ACLs list.
I don't understand.
So you had 2 lists, one of each of the URLs of the documents, and then the second list was each of the ACLs.
Yeah.
So that's
They're in sequence.
correspond.
They're in sequence.
Yeah.
So one 0 matches with 0, 1 matches with 1. So that's how it goes. So you have to make sure you remove the right one. So, okay, cool. So, I finished 20 minutes early, but hopefully this was useful. Anybody learned anything new? Cool. So I have 2 more sessions today. The next one is about apps, and the one after that, and they're continuous. So the next one is 11:30 or whatever the next one is, and then after that I have another one about apps, and then REST and CSOM. And then tomorrow I have a full post-con workshop, and I also do trainings and consulting. My contact information is on my slide, or you can just Google for my name and go to my site, and you can go to this contact button on the right hand top. It'll come up in a second. This contact button on the right hand top, shoot me an email. And I do in-house trainings and consulting, and I also have open courses, so I look forward to hearing from you. Hope you found this useful, and don't forget to leave the feedback on the app, the DevWeek app, and thank you very much. So love to take any questions you have at this time, or have a great conference.